Hello, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. I'm recording this on Thursday night, wishing you a wonderful Shabbat for May 8th and 9th, Parshat Emor. Parshat Emor, the next book, Parsha in the book of Leviticus, has a lot of beautiful stuff in it, but it begins with a mindset that I think is distinctly challenging to contemporary American Jews, probably Jews elsewhere than America, but that's where we are. And it begins with a set of rules about the priests, about sanctifying the priests, the Kohanim, the priestly caste, and the kind of perfection that their life is supposed to embody. And that is written literally on their bodies. Their bodies are supposed to be unblemished in any number of ways, and they're supposed to, based on who they marry, supposed to indicate a certain kind of perfection. And that does not sit well with contemporary life. I think I can understand what motivated ancient people to feel this way, and it helps me speculate at least about how different our spiritual mindset is than theirs. I think that ancient people lived in a world that was profoundly terrifying, profoundly disorderly, and they strived to make some zone in the temple, in the tabernacle, in the people who worked in the tabernacle, a sense of perfection. And so when we read in the Torah that a Kohen who was a hunchback or castrated or had funny eyes or funny arms and legs couldn't serve, that strikes us as just morally perverse and discriminatory towards people for their physical difference. And it is. In our world, there's no way that this flies. But in their world, I think that it represented that in this world where people got sick and died all the time and inexplicably, and people had all kinds of physical ailments, there was one place you could go where everything looked in order. And so the priests represented a kind of order. Needless to say, that's not the spiritual mindset that contemporary people come to. And to illustrate the difference, I'm going to turn from the Kohen to a different Kohen, Leonard Cohen. I think one of the popular music songs that most illustrates American, for North American, he was Canadian, of course, North American spirituality is Leonard Cohen's song Anthem, with the wonderful line that I hear people quote all the time. I quote myself. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I think that much more animates and explains our spirituality. We look for the broken places where the order falls apart, and we find that to be spiritual. Oddly enough, I'm going to suggest to you that the rabbi's interpretation of Parshat Emor has a little bit of Leonard Cohen for the Kohen, a little bit of a sense of the disorder carved out of the otherwise orderly. The Parsha begins with the commandment that the Kohen, who is oriented towards life, who is oriented towards order, is not supposed to come into contact with any dead bodies except for a small number of relatives. La nefesh lo yitama be'amav. He shall defile himself, become ritually impure, for no dead body among his people, be'amav. Well, that word be'amav suggests that the dead body has been integrated into a family system and that there are people who are caring for that person. But the classical rabbinic interpretation of that verse is that the Kohen should not defile himself for a person in the bosom of family, but for what is called a meit mitzvah, an abandoned corpse. A meit mitzvah, the meit is the dead person, the mitzvah is the commandment to drop absolutely everything to tend to an abandoned corpse. The ancient rabbis and the halachic tradition regards with unique horror. I can't think of anything else that sparked in our classical sages the revulsion of an abandoned corpse. We all the time talk about people as being created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, by which we generally mean that some people have a little divine spark, or they have a soul, or they have rationality. I think for the ancient rabbis who lived in Palestine in the 1st and 2nd century, the rabbis of the Mishnaic era, there was a specific technical meaning to b'tselem Elohim. A tselem is a statue or an idol. And they, living in Greco-Roman cities, they saw idols absolutely everywhere they went. Judaism, we don't have idols, except one. A human being is the Tselem Elohim. A human being is the image of God. We don't have images of Zeus. We don't have images of Jupiter or Mars. But every time you see a human being, you see someone who stands for the presence of God, who in their beauty, in their specialness, in their order, in their integrity, that's the divine image. And to see an abandoned corpse, don't mean to be gross here, but a dead body decomposes and it's set upon by scavenger animals and it's not pretty. And so if they saw a human being left to putrefy in public, that was just the worst. It was tantamount to denying the God who animated the human life. It's bizayon in the worst, bizayon, disgrace in the worst way. So everybody had to, if you came across a abandoned corpse, it doesn't matter if you are a Kohen, it doesn't matter if you are the Kohen Gadol, the leading priest, it doesn't matter if you are a Nazarite, it doesn't matter if you are the king, it doesn't matter if you are engaged in any other important mitzvah, you drop whatever you are doing to tend to the Meit Mitzvah. I've been thinking about the Meit Mitzvah in these recent weeks of the COVID epidemic because I have sometimes found myself the only or almost the only person at a funeral. Now, of course, the people with whom I'm, for whom I am going to the funeral, they're not abandoned. Their family hasn't done anything wrong or unloving, but the requirements and the restrictions mean that we can't have the kind of funerals and farewells that we are accustomed to. But I have felt myself a little bit metaphorically in the posture of somebody who is dealing with a Meit Mitzvah, as I am the only or one of the only persons who stands beside their grave as they are lowered into the earth. It reminds me, and reminds you perhaps if you're a lover of American literature, of the scene at the end of The Great Gatsby, where Nick Carraway is almost the only person at Gatsby's funeral as the rain pours into his open grave. It's a very heartbreaking scene. And I feel that same sense of heartbreak lately when I'm in those spots, one of the only, or in some cases, the only person standing beside this grave. It's how we sense the tragic dimension of this plague. There are people who are leaving this earth not surrounded by their loved ones, not accompanied by the people with whom they shared their lives, almost all alone. This sense of Meit Mitzvah, of tending to someone, standing with someone as they are lowered into the earth, really brings home to me the tragedy of this plague. And I think of the Jewish normative practice that you must drop everything to respond to the death of one of your fellow human beings and tend to their body as our traditions wrestling with tragedy. There's nothing pretty about this loss, but we have to rise to the occasion. And so the concept of Meit Mitzvah, in addition to being a response to tragedy, it is a promise. It is a promise that every Jew says to every other one, that we say to every person, you will not be left alone. You're precious. Your journey and your time on earth are worthy of respect and attention, and I will not leave you alone. Even in this plague, I will walk beside you. To turn back to our Parsha for a moment, the Parsha begins in the illustration of our tradition wrestling with the desire for order in the person of the Kohen and the reality of tragedy that sometimes emergencies come and force us to deal with death, is illustrated in a midrash on the first line of the Parsha. The first line of the Parsha has a strange redundancy. It goes, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Emor el HaKohanim ve'amarta alehem. God says to Moses, say to the priests and say to them. And it repeats that verb, Emor ve'amarta, it repeats twice, seemingly redundantly. And the midrash from Vaikra Rabbah, the classic collection of what were probably synagogue sermons, at least some of them were synagogue sermons in ancient Palestine. The midrash says, I'm going to tell you two things. God says to Moshe, I want you to convey two things to the priests. The first thing is, La nefesh lo yitama be'amav. Do not come into contact with the dead bodies. You, priest, you are a messenger of life. And your work in the temple is about life. It is not a death cult. It is not we're not fetishizing death. I want you to focus on life. Ve'amarta alehem. The second thing I'm going to tell you, says this midrash, is that sometimes you have to face a tragic reality. Death is real. And sometimes our normal systems and our normal families and the normal ways that we can take care of dead bodies, sometimes they don't work. Sometimes circumstances intervene and we can't do what we expect to do, what we want to do. And so then you have to come through and you have to drop whatever else you're doing. And you have to accompany one of your fellow human beings as they leave this earth. As much as this religion is a celebration of life and not of death, it also reminds us that sometimes we have to deal with the Meit Mitzvah. And this is the time that we're in. So I feel myself called, and everybody, you know, most of you are not going to be able to find yourselves in the role that I find myself. But we all have to make the promise to each other as much as possible that we will not abandon each other in frightful times, that while we're alive, it's the most important thing. We're going to call each other, we're going to speak to each other, we're going to be in contact with each other. But even in those most terrible moments when we can't provide the tahara that we typically do for a person who's died, we can't accompany them in the funeral, we're not going to leave them alone. These ancient synagogue homilies usually tried to end off with a hopeful note. They usually tried to end off with some kind of comfort, even when they had to talk about bad things like this one. And our midrash, the midrash that I'm quoting, is no exception. It relates that Moses is supposed to tell the people the first time, the Kohanim, the first time, avoid the dead bodies, and the second time, you're going to have to deal with the dead bodies. And then, I'll just read it to you. So the second one says, Be'amira shniya, in the second statement, Amar lo im ba meit mitzvah liyadcha hizakek. If in a tragic circumstance you find a corpse that nobody else is tending to, you're going to have to come through for that. Lefi sheba'olam hazeh hakohen mitameh lemeit mitzvah. In this world, even the symbol of order, the kohen, is going to have to deal with the meit mitzvah. And here comes the little bit of nechama, a little bit of comfort. Aval la'atid lavo. But there is a coming future world in which there will be no death. And it quotes the verse that is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. It's the verse with which we usually end Shiva, from Isaiah chapter 25. Bila hamavet lanetzach umacha Adonai Elohim dima me'al kol panim. One day may God swallow up death forever and dry all the tears off all of our cheeks. That's the God that I believe in, and I wish you a wonderful Shabbat Shalom.